Possiamo. È un gran piacere, grazie mille per aver aderito a questo invito, è veramente un piacere per noi avere di nuovo ospite Tom Klein. È ormai, diciamo così, quasi una tradizione avere un seminario con lui all'inizio dell'anno ed è sempre un piacere e un privilegio. Dan insegna alla George Mason University, come sapete ha una forte tradizione nei temi del public choice, nei temi, diciamo così, di un approccio affine alle idee liberali dell'economia e si è occupato di tante cose, si è occupato nel tempo delle idee, delle convinzioni degli economisti, per esempio insieme a moglie e Lotta Stern hanno chiarito che gli economisti hanno convinzioni un po' diverse da quelle che si pensa tipicamente. No. Si è occupato di diverse questioni applicate, a cominciare per esempio dal funzionamento della Food and Drug Administration, si è occupato di fornitura privata dei beni pubblici, ma negli ultimi anni si è occupato molto e con grande profondità di questioni schiettamente teoriche, di storia del pensiero, si è occupato anche di cercare un po' di salvare la parola liberal, la parola liberalism da usi, diciamo così, non so se impropri, ma contemporanei e in tensione rispetto al significato originario di queste parole. Il tema di questa sera è, credo, è una domanda, insomma il titolo, ed è una domanda che ci siamo fatti tutti, credo, qualche volta. Perché i funzionari governativi credono che cattive politiche possano far bene? Dicevo immediatamente la parola per rispondere a questa domanda e siamo ben sicuri che ciascuno di noi con esperienze, sfumature e storie diverse poi potrà, diciamo così, fornire un piccolo contributo di esperienza a questa questione. Intanto grazie ancora per essere con noi questa sera.
So it's an honor and a pleasure to be hosted by Liel and by my good friend Alberto. And thank you all for coming out tonight. So I'm an American, and the kind of institutions and dynamics, I guess, are more of an American context that I have in mind, but I suspect it will generalize a good deal to Italy and humankind in general. I have 57 slides, but I'm going to try to be pretty smooth and quick. Why do government officials believe in the goodness of bad policy? It's a good question, right? I was happy when I came up with this title. In fact, unfortunately, it was after I published the article under a crummier title. So there's the article if you want to find it on my website, but I like my new title. So why do bad policies exist and prevail? These are some that most economists would agree are bad policies and just say are not good, should be repealed. And I would say we liberal economists would go even further to many others that are out there. So there's really a lot of bad policy out there. Why is bad policy being put in place and persisting for so long? One type of answer is a kind of cynicism. Some people are benefiting from this, special interests are laughing all the way to the bank at the cost to society in general. But curiously, if you meet some of the people involved, you'll find that they don't seem so dishonest. They seem rather sincere, in fact. So we continue to have this question. David Hume said that it's a a just political maxim to suppose every man a knave, that is to say, kind of a cheat. Though at the same time, it appears somewhat strange that a maxim should be true in politics, which is false, in fact. Not every man is a knave. It's not even clear that most men are knaves. But when you're doing politics, you should assume it's going to be knaves. And you should do your politics accordingly. So a different interpretation is that it's not evil, but just, as it were, systematic error. Persistent error. For some reason, errors that don't get corrected, but why don't they get corrected? Why aren't people prepared to learn that 2 + 2 is not equal 5? And the kinds of answers I'm going to offer are cultural. And these cultural answers, of course, apply to the population in general. I think Alberto and I and many of you would agree that there's widespread wrong-headed thinking about politics and policy. So it's not just a narrow question of government officials. So there's big human psychology questions on the table here, but we are going to focus tonight on government officials. We can perhaps expand it in the Q&A. There's a wrinkle to the whole story I'm going to tell, and that's that in a government agency, sometimes new leaders can be put in at the top. Like, for example, a new government comes in and presidential appointments put new people with very different thinking at the head of an agency. And that's really outside of my main type of theorizing here, but I will come back to this as just an important, complication or different wrinkle on the whole thing. So getting down to, this kind of cultural theorizing, these are the three types of mechanisms. I'm going to talk about self-sorting, screening, and then something they call belief plasticity and the lock-in of certain beliefs. So starting with self-sorting, suppose that you have certain beliefs about politics and policy, beliefs about the worthiness of what a government agency is doing, and they are in conflict with that organization. So your beliefs are different than the main beliefs at, let's say, a government agency. What are your options? There are 5 options. You could depart the agency or never enter the agency or organization. 2, you could enter and try to change it. Change everybody's mind at work. Good luck. 3, you could play the cynic by getting on and supporting the goals while privately rejecting the culture, right? That's good European cynicism. I think we see that around. You could remain within the organization, but openly voice your dissenting view. Or you could embrace the culture of the organization. Well, how are those working out for you? Again, the presupposition here is that you have decided beliefs which are in conflict. So, look, you're not going to be able to change the culture. Playing the cynic is not a personally satisfying thing to do if you really don't believe in it. Openly voicing dissent will also be unpleasant for you. Embracing the culture will also be not very satisfactory because you don't agree with it. You disagree. We suppose that. And furthermore, you got to think about their side. How much are they going to tolerate if you try to change the culture? Or if you play the cynic and they can kind of tell that you don't really believe. And if you openly voice dissent, right, they might expel you. So there's a screening out, expulsion, as well as the problem of you're not wanting to, of basically you're leaving yourself. So I think the main likely thing in that case is expulsion. Because the dynamics of you're not liking it there and they're wanting to expel you because your beliefs are different, are just going to interact to probably lead you out of the agency. You were just telling me that was your experience in city government.
Exactly that.
Exactly that. Okay, so departing the organization is most likely. Now, I want to read this very nice Hayek quote because it's something that deserves to be more familiar. And this is the start of it. It actually goes on for 4 slides. I'm not going to read all my quotes, but this one I'm going to read. The organizations we have created in the fields of labor, agriculture, housing, education, etc., have grown so complex that it takes more or less the whole of a person's time to master them. The institutional expert is frequently the only one who understands the institution's organization fully and who therefore is indispensable. Almost invariably, this kind of expert has one distinguishing characteristic. He is unhesitatingly in favor of the institutions on which he is expert. This is so not merely because only one who approves of the aims of the institution will have the interest and the patience to master the details, but even more because such an effort would hardly be worth the while of anybody else. The views of anybody who is not prepared to accept the principles of the existing institutions are not likely to be taken seriously and will carry no weight. As a result of this development in more and more fields of policy, nearly all the recognized experts are, almost by definition, persons who are in favor of the principles underlying the policy. The politicians who, in recommending some further development of current policies, claims that all the experts favor it is often perfectly honest, because only those who favor the development have become experts in this institutional sense, and the uncommitted economists or lawyers who oppose are not counted as experts. Once the apparatus is established, its future development will be shaped by what those who have chosen to serve it regard as its, I don't know, what's the rest of it? its purposes or something. I don't know, I'm off the screen, but it's okay. But he captured, Hayek, it's kind of remarkable how he thought about all these things and actually did a lot of social theorizing in his liberal presentation. This is just Thomas Szasz saying, why do we lack about the drug war? Why do we lack a right we possessed in the past, to do marijuana and cocaine and what have you? These are some of the basic questions not discussed in debates on drugs. Why not? Because admission into the closed circle of officially recognized drug law experts is contingent on shunning such rude behavior. And so you must accept as a premise the justifications essentially for the current policy. So we see those kinds of things to support that self-sorting and screening out effect that we've talked about. Now I want to change the initial assumption and now say you don't have an opinion. You don't have a strong opinion about the government agency. Maybe it's the Agriculture Department or the Antitrust Division or the Food and Drugs or whatever it is. You don't have a strong opinion, okay? You come to the organization and you go to work, okay? I want to suggest that very often you adapt, maybe not you personally, because this is a special group, but people adapt to the prevailing culture, okay? And they fit into the group thing, right? This is the group. And this is their thing. As an individual, making a career, trying to take care of your own family and so on, your purposes depend on your situation. Individuals would believe different ideas if their situations were different. Okay, so belief structures are plastic. They are affected by the heat and pressure of everyday experience, like what makes you get on with your colleagues, what keeps you in your job, what elevates you in your job, what gets you respect at work. I've got a couple of quotations here from H.L. Mencken that are about, he was fascinated by this belief plasticity, and he tells some stories here about belief plasticity, and he's a very amusing guy. I don't know if you've heard of him. He died in 1956, but I won't read these, but maybe go back and look at them sometime. William James, the famous pragmatist philosopher, said, "You may alter your house ad libitum, but the ground plan of the first architect persists. You can make great changes, but you cannot change a Gothic church into a Doric temple." So once you start adapting, right, you kind of are on a path, all right? I want to draw on a couple of these social psychology principles. This is from Robert Cialdini's great book, Influence. First is truths are us, that people rely on social cues. And we see this like in TV programs with canned laughter, cueing you to laugh. bartenders salting their tip jars with dollar bills, preachers seating their audience with enthusiasts in the first row. Come on, Carlo, you gotta jump up and start. Or even when hundreds of people line up in orderly fashion to partake of lethal poison, as they did in Jonestown in 1978. Social cues really are very powerful. And if social proof has power, certainly it can do much to reinforce the beliefs and practices of duly created government agencies. I mean, they have all this authority and sort of official validation behind all of their practices. And you can think of this as parallel to immersion in the Moonies. 4 steps. Potential recruits are first contacted individually and invited to come to a 2-day weekend workshop. These workshops are then followed by a 7-day workshop, a 12-day workshop, and finally membership. And at each of these 4 steps, of course, the people who are only half-hearted, the people who are not enthusiastic, they peel away. Either they don't get invited or they decide not to go to the next step. And so what you get are the people who are more and more into it. And so you get this intense set of social cues, right, down to the final membership. And this is exactly what happens, in career and in work and in life, and I think very much in government employment. For example, these kinds of departments. And so you get also taboos and superstitions that work in those contexts. Now let's turn to Cialdini's principle of self-consistency and commitment. It's just that people fancy themselves consistent beings. And once a person has taken steps down a certain path, he is receptive to information that supports it and turns away from information that doesn't support it. This is also known as confirmation bias. It's very well established. Adam Smith said, "The opinion which we entertain of our own character depends entirely on our judgments concerning our past conduct. It is so disagreeable to think ill of ourselves that we often purposefully turn away our view from those circumstances which might render that judgment unfavorable." So people are sort of in denial about the commitments they've made and really about the worthiness of the commitments they've made. So you can think about someone, say, rising to the state medical licensing board. This is, the people who decide the standards for requirements for medical licensing and so on. Such a person, for example, would have to first be a prominent member of the profession. Then he would find a position in the professional association. And after gaining the confidence of influential people in the establishment, he might finally join the state licensing board. That further step-by-step immersion, just like with the Moonies. So he's then enveloped by the inner culture of the profession. Outside viewpoints are cleaved away and politely dismissed and maybe privately disparaged. Groupthink goes for all organizations, including private organizations, okay? But there are big differences. It's not like, oh, it's symmetric and the problem's here and the problem's here. So what are you making such a fuss about government in particular for? No, there are big asymmetries. First of all, the government is far more dangerous, right? I mean, what can those big oil companies do to us? They can raise the price of gasoline, right? Whereas the government can do all sorts of things to us. It can tax us more, it can control us more, it can restrict our liberties more, it can do all sorts of stuff more. Much far-reaching coercive power. And so these theories of groupthink have been applied especially to government contexts by these thinkers, for example. But there's something even very different, else that's very different. Well, private organizations depend on voluntary support and participation. And if they're doing things wrong, the people participating will stop or complain. They cannot participate anymore, right? It's voluntary. Unless they have some sort of government privilege that forces people to buy their product or pay for their product through taxation without voluntary choice or something like that, they have to correct themselves when they have stinking beliefs. If their beliefs are really foolish and ineffective and inefficient, these mechanisms, these correction mechanisms of voluntary support and participation are going to press them towards correction. That's sort of the marketplace, but even just for charities, private charities and other private institutions that depend on voluntary participation. But the government uses coercion, and these mechanisms are much, much weaker, right? They might be pretty much entirely absent. I mean, you're going to write and say, hey, I don't like being taxed this high, or I don't, and then your voice is just lost in this vast ocean of public opinion. So the government has this power of coercion that just breaks down the correction mechanisms. They can get beliefs locked in, okay? And then use their power to shut people up, to shut down competitors and opponents and critics and so on. So it's a very, very different story with government. Now I want to make an analogy with technical or technological systems. There's theories of technological problems, of bad technologies getting locked in, and these have been theorized, and I think these theories fit this cultural story quite well. So what's a famous example for the technology story? It's different gauges of railroad. You could have this smaller gauge or this larger gauge. And once one of these gauges starts to get used in a system, it'll tend to perpetuate itself. It'll get locked in. Now, the one that first gets started might not be the better one. It might be the worst one. But even if you got the bad one started, it might persist and not be corrected for some of these special reasons here. These are some other examples of different systems or standards. We've got this ridiculous system in the we Anglophile types of feet. Like, I don't even know how many ounces are in a pound or how many feet are in a mile. Like, I couldn't even tell you. It's a really stupid system, but it got locked in, right? And the keyboard has been complained in this way. So this is path dependence and lock-in, and this guy, Paul David, has theorized about it, and I want to follow his thinking. Now, he's kind of an interventionist, in fact, on this matter of technology. And when it actually comes to technology, I don't think the case for government intervention is at all strong, as these free market economists have shown. I won't go into that, but I want to say I do like Paul David's theory for our topic, right? The culture, particularly within a government agency. So I'll draw on him. And he lays out three key features. Again, he has railroad gauges in mind, but I'm going to take these three features and do them for the culture. First, quasi-irreversibility. That means that once you start investing in a way of thinking and the practices that go with it, it's hard to just reverse those investments. It's just like it's hard once you lay down this track to like say, oh, now we're going to switch to this track, right? There's a lot of investment you've made that you don't get back if you decide to change. It's sunk cost or quasi-sunk, partly sunk. Obviously some of it is done, like you still got the root and you've cleared the ground and graded the ground. So it's only quasi, but still there's some that's irreversible. That's feature one. And I think that's true of beliefs. Technical interrelatedness. That is that if I'm working on this system, that gives you an incentive to work on the same system, because then we can work together. And the more people out there who are using the system makes it more attractive for me to use that system. And if you think about it, that makes it self-reinforcing, because then I join the crowd that incents other people, and people start going to that other system, just like our stupid system of 16 ounces to a pound, and how many pints and quarts and gallons, I don't even know. But we keep doing it. And then the other one is economies of scale, which is that the more people in this system, the easier it is to just teach someone the new system, because there's so many people to inform them and reinforce how it works. So these are Paul David's theories, and all of these things I think apply beautifully to the cultural theory that we're talking about, particularly in the government agency. Yeah, so we've got all these mechanisms here, and all of these things now lead us to expect a quite uniform kind of culture within the agency. Maybe there's some private cynicism and dissent, but it's quiet. Mostly a very uniform culture. Now, what kind of culture will it be? I've made a bunch of arguments about uniformity, but what? What kind of culture? What kind of beliefs? And I want to suggest that actually there are ways to generalize about it. So in terms of the genealogy, if you will, of organizational culture, origins and incentives, I think, give us ground for generalizing here. 2 principles. First, what I'm calling the self-exaltation principle. Everyone has an incentive to exalt themselves, kind of morally. Everyone wants more comfort and wealth. Almost everyone wants recognition, power, eminence, prestige. We want a sense of significance, importance. We want to feel important. We feel important when we can believe a story in which we get to play the hero and go around tell that story to everybody we meet. We want to take credit. I mean, that's just like you and me, right? We're like the liberal hero here. We want to be the liberal hero. We're no better than anyone. Anyway, we want to take credit for both the good and the greatness achieved. So this principle will lead to tend to lead to a glorification of the agencies that people work for. They'll find prestige in their position. They'll come to find legitimacy as well. They like to see their agency's actions as the cause of achievement and themselves the cause of the agency's actions. This will be part of a person's sacred beliefs, to use Jonathan Haidt's expression. Okay. And so what does this lead to? Well, it's a belief in the agency. It's a belief in its mission and its activities, and hence favor for the pursuit of expanded power of the agency and the government, and reluctance to surrender it. So, and then the second principle is what I call the founding principle. Okay. And the founding of any path-dependent process gives a foothold to what path is going to develop. So what is the founding? What is that first foothold? It's a story about how social affairs needed governmentalization. That is to say, either government control or government ownership. So the founding theory was that liberal arrangements had failed and the government was needed. So we liberals are likely to see badness persisting in the cultural system, since those agencies were founded to abridge liberal arrangements. That's what got a foothold. So these 2 principles then, I suggest, tell us what kind of cultures to expect. And I think they're well supported in, if we look around at what the government agencies do and believe in. Pro-governmentalization attitudes. Here's a quote from a couple scholars from years ago. It's just saying that the established school of players are, in fact, they say they're all for the public good, but underneath it, they're dedicated to hierarchical control and the formalization of education. They're speaking of the teachers' unions and such. And so all of this put together now, we do have theories of why bad policies persist. okay? And it's kind of like the poles of a teepee frame. They're sort of supporting each other. They're not all independently grounded. Like we're saying this teepee is a bad thing, so why is it standing? It's not really being supported or raised up by something else. It's that we've got all these poles kind of supporting each other. I like this quote, I gotta share it. How is the world ruled? He wrote during World War I. How is the world ruled and led to war? Diplomats lie to journalists and believe those lies when they see them in print. So they do kind of come to believe it. They do actually believe in this sacred beliefs and the selfhood and the whole story that they're living out, at least often. Maybe more in America. Mencken said, and they are not the less quacks when they happen to be quite honest. So he's saying they're quacks, but they can be honest, like they actually believe their quackery. I've got to read this from Jefferson. It would be dangerous delusion or confidence in the men of our choice to silence our fears for the safety of our rights. That confidence is everywhere the parent of despotism. Free government is founded in jealousy and not in confidence. It is jealousy and not confidence which prescribes limited constitutions to bind down those whom we are obliged to trust with power. That's kind of like the Hume quote from the beginning. We got to assume they're knaves. Don't have any confidence in their not being knaves. So bind them down as best you can. Is there hope here? Generally speaking, it's insulation from criticism, which sustains these bad cultures. And we all know that communications are a lot more powerful in a lot of respects anyway. So maybe we can criticize and word can get out despite those agencies. I think of marijuana liberalization in the United States. That's been a very successful and, optimistic experience. So it's not a lockstep formula. It's not ironclad logic that I'm telling you. There are other features. And then there's this issue about political appointments at the top. The Trump administration has actually made some quite good, I would say, personnel choices and inserted people, into tops of agencies who are very different from probably the rank and file of almost the entire agency below them. And so you can obviously get a different source of selection and beliefs, inserting of beliefs, even challenge of these dominant theories from political appointments under special conditions, I guess you could say. And so now we have people at the top, often at odds with the staff. Reform is still very difficult, and you have all sorts of conflicts within the organization. But even if we can't change it, I think it's good to understand that all this is how it tends to work, just so we understand what's going on and we kind of can know what not to put too much faith in and not to expect too much and be kind of ironic about, how the world is around us. Yeah, that's it. Thanks a lot.
Well, the cultural reference at the end wasn't lost on the audience. We got moving to this too. Well, thank you very much. That's a lot on the table. There's really plenty of stuff to talk about. Actually, looking at Carlo, because he gave a similar presentation a few months ago to our board on his own experience in the stomach of the whale. So I'd like to hear his views first.
Yeah, thank you, Alberto. Thank you, Dan, for the presentation. I find it very well done and convincing, the arguments you set forward. I would like to reinforce one and add one extra argument you didn't touch on. The first one is the issue of self-selection. it is more likely that you try to have a career within an organization if you believe that that organization can do a lot of good to society than if you believe that there is a fundamentally evil organization that should be shut down as soon as possible. If you are an environmentalist, you are likely to try to work in the renewable power sector rather than in an oil company. And by the same token, if you are a statist, you are more likely to be willing to work within the state than if you are a liberal European sense. And that leads to some extent to the kind of phenomenon that you described. I mean, people try to enter the state because they believe the state is useful in the first place, and which leads to have a greater amount of people within governments at various layers of government who believe that government should be expanded, should do good, generally speaking. The second point is that this is probably very Italian, but I think it also makes sense elsewhere. Within governmental organization, you have plenty of lawyers everywhere, and which means that you have a majority of people working within the government know perfectly how to write a law, but they have no clue of what happens the next day. They basically lack any understanding of economics, and to some extent they even refuse economics. If the law says this, then this must happen. They do not understand that there is a difference between the aims of a law and the effects of a law. This is what has been described by somebody as geeks versus suits. You have a lot of suits within government and the scarcity of geeks, regardless of whether geeks are Keynesians or liberals or whatever. And trying to get more geeks into government usually can improve government from our point of view, because at least it leads within government the ability to deal with evidence. And finally, I totally agree with your latest point that producing information and making it available to government officials, both elected and rank and file, more information about what happens if you pass a law or if you don't pass a law, can do no harm. Finally, I totally agree with the marijuana liberalization point. I think that there should be also more marijuana within government. More fun and less harm.
Want to comment on these, or just collect some more?
That all makes sense. You make the picture even darker for everybody. That all makes sense. Thank you.
In the 1980s, before most of you were born, British TV promoted an extraordinary TV series that I think should be taught everywhere, which is, of course, Yes Minister. And the series presented, for those who have never heard of it, a permanent confrontation between two characters. One is a newly appointed minister of a mysterious minister of administrative affairs that obviously doesn't exist in Britain or anywhere else. And the other is the chief of staff of his ministry.
Sir Humphrey.
Sir Humphrey, who is a sort of civil servant, long career civil servant from an Oxford college with his own staff and so on. Without getting into details, I mean, what the series showed was that they both make the wrong decisions for different reasons. The minister, because he's permanently seeking visibility, attention, popularity, he wants to be seen to be doing something new, something which actually since the 80s has obviously become much more quick and much more pressing for elected representatives. While of course the position of Sir Humphrey, of the civil servant, is to slow things down as much and stop every sort of change, because this will make life much easier for everybody. They're used to doing things like that, whether they're good or bad. They don't want to be pushed to change. Now, the point I wanted to make is that, I mean, this may be a caricature, of course, of how things work, but what seems apparent from this kind of logic is that both make the wrong decisions partly because of their interaction. So there is something perverse, and it is not a very comforting thought, in the interaction between people who are desperate to be seen, that they're changing, they're doing reforms and so on, and people who by reaction try to resist, because, and it is possible that the same agency, if it wasn't confronted with this kind of constant assault of people who decide that, okay, let's do the reddito di cittadinanza tomorrow, we don't know how to do it, but let's go, guys, and try to do it, and so on. Maybe they would be, more responsive or more capable to, because you would think they don't have to respond to electors, they can just do what they think is right. But they can't, because, they're constantly under assault. So anyway, this is I wonder whether you had any thoughts about this kind of perverse dynamics.
No, that's a really good analogy, or Yes Minister, which I'm not that familiar with, I'm ashamed to say. And your summary of it about the plot structure, the character structure is very useful. And it suggests that, well, I'm picking up on certain psychological forces about self-exaltation and I want to be a hero. Maybe it's more like you're saying, and the politician just wants popularity, attention, re-election, and the chief of staff just wants make things work, do what we know, keep at it, keep things simple. Maybe those are strong psychological forces within the agencies as well. They don't contradict what I'm saying. They could all kind of be there playing their part. I mean, if the chief of staff wants to keep things going, he'll at least say, like, we're doing it right. Like, he will defend the goodness of whatever the policy is, no matter how bad. No, that all makes sense. And if you're suggesting that the role of the politician in particular is kind of making things worse and getting in the way because they're throwing up ideas and trying to gain headlines, sound exciting, making reforms, whereas maybe what would be good is if we're kind of doomed to the fate of experts in these agencies, maybe just like give them a free hand and pray for the best. I'm sympathetic. I mean, think of Hong Kong before democracy, right?
But I'm not suggesting that we should live in a technocracy.
Yeah, I know, but I mean, like, which is the worst evil? Like Hong Kong with democracy or Hong Kong with British civil servants? Yeah. I'll take British civil servants in that age anyway.
Yeah, but I think one of the points which is interesting is that mixing the two actually may lead to a worse outcome. By the way, in Yes Minister, you got one of what, I mean, Sir Humphrey has many memorable quotes, but one of the best one I just searched for it is, government policy has nothing to do with common sense. And that comes out actually a very intense dialogue between Sir Humphrey and the minister. I don't know if it's, at a certain point he becomes Prime Minister. Yeah. And he's really it's a good guy. I mean, you sympathize with him. He's a good man. And invariably, at the beginning of each episode, he has a nice idea. I mean, he comes up with, and almost invariably, at the end of the show, the whole thing is completely twisted. Because you got a little bit of party politics, but also you got the interaction with civil servants. But this comes out of a conversation in which they are discussing the matter of selling weapons to terrorists. And terrorists being Italian terrorists at the time. So British weapons, but Italian terrorists. And Sir Humphrey is arguing that, they cannot basically check, what happens with a weapon at the moment they sold it. And the minister said, well, this is against common sense. And our fields replied, well, government policy has nothing to do with common sense. So, but this is just one of the many vignettes, actually, that are quite enlightening. And I suppose that it's very difficult to claim anything like that. But I suppose, yes, minister, had something to do with the climate, speaking of public
Well, of
opinion
course,
in the
I
UK.
mean, if we wanted a seminar on this, what is important is that Humphrey represents the establishment.
Yes.
You know, it's Oxford, the minister is new conservatives, is a Thatcher kind of minister, so he doesn't have the right background. You know, he doesn't come from the right school.
Well, I think it's legal, but it doesn't come out.
No, it's not legal, no, definitely not. I mean,
It comes from the
well, we
LSE.
have another seminar.
It comes from the LSE, so they got many British, discussion on Oxbridge versus the LSE, and so there's some points in which even you from the LSE can say that. It's very snobbish.
Be careful, because it is true that policy has nothing to do with common sense, but when policy has anything to do with common sense, it's much worse.
That may have been
not
Humphrey's
common
point,
sense,
no?
but people's opinions, not valid common sense. In that fashion. No, but we don't want to enter to yes, Prime Minister, but I think this is another relevant point, so which is the background of people. So the technocracy now is selected to a process, which is a meritocracy in its own right. Government officials are elected. And, we know that you may be elected without passing through that much of a meritocratic system, particularly these days.
Well, I have, this is intriguing. My name is Grandori. I'm a professor at Bocconi University. I've studied decision making ever since in my life. That's why I'm here. And I was attracted by the specificity of government official, because what the first part of what you highlighted, why people believe in the governance of best policy. I mean, the word is full, okay? Also firm official, also anyone. I mean, all the study, all the biases that you pointed out, self-confirmation, groupthink, blah, blah, are ubiquitous.
Yes.
You stated more than demonstrated, I would say, that in public setting, these biases should be stronger than in private. I mean, that's a very strong claim. There might be counterexample or counter arguments. For example, you have in private organization, you don't have structured opposition. You are dependent, can be hired and fired very easily. So you are very dependent on authority. So the degree of belief in the godliness of that policy, which derives from self-confirmation and conformism, may be even higher. Because in any case, an empirical counterexample would be in my study of decision making. Some of the most competent decision makers in terms of procedure, avoiding biases, that I ever found are in the Aeronautica Militare. So the people that are in charge of safety in flight, and they are, with respect to the average,
It's a government agency.
they are really tough. But therefore, but what I find actually, I would translate intriguing, is in the argument is another part. So is the sort of thesis that let me call the impossibility of liberalistic policies, in fact, because your argument is if you are into the government, you are pro-government, you tend to identify and defend by taking part in your institution. So the implication seems to be any party that claims to be liberalistic but go to government cannot maintain that. Is that an implication? You cannot have.
I do think that's a huge problem, and I do think it's
That's what-
somewhat paradoxical to
Yeah.
have liberals governing.
Yeah,
And I think that
that's what I
like
found.
the Liberal Party in Britain had problems of this sort, and any political movement that gains some kind of power that has done so on the Thatcher and so on. I mean, they don't necessarily carry through or make a good show of liberalization. I think because it is difficult, and they run into all of these problems, resistance, and so I think it is. I think it's a very right point that it's very hard
It would be
for
an
liberals to
implication.
be government.
Yeah,
Um,
it's a claim.
I think it's a very serious problem. And then there's big disappointment, and then they say, oh, the liberals failed, and look how bad it was under the liberals, even if it wasn't that bad. I mean, no matter what, they're going to say that, right? But I can also react to your other point, your first one about, I do think, I'm very willing to try to defend my claim about the asymmetry.
Okay.
I don't know, I mean, give me an example of a private organization. I mean, just a kind of, you want to say a business, you want to say a private charity,
Let's see
a
how.
church, a private church?
Let's see who can beat Fiat or IBM in terms of conformism or believing in
look,
the goodness of bad policies.
I mean, for the most part, they ultimately have to get their funding from people buying their cars, or whatever it is that Fiat is selling nowadays. Mostly cars. And so if their belief systems are not producing cars of decent quality at reasonable costs, they're going to get the message. They're going to get a message. If they're having too large expense accounts for their employees and wasting money and so on. So I mean, I guess it could be in there, but it's going to tend to drive up the costs of their cars or be reflected in the higher price of their cars, which means less people buying their cars. And so at the end of the day, their resources are matters of private voluntary choice where people are spending their own money on themselves. And that's going to send signals, to an organization, to its leaders.
Like the voters.
No, not like voters. It's not really much like voters at all. I mean, when I vote, I'm not really making choices for myself. In fact, I'm not even making a choice that's
No,
going
the
to.
voters, I mean, the parallel that has been made is, of course, between consumers and voters. The signals come from different users.
Yeah, but they're much different in their effectiveness and meaningfulness and incentives behind them. I think. I mean, people might speak of them as they might compare them, but I think the results of a proper comparison is that they're very, very different. I don't think democratic politics is much at all like deciding I want to buy this bottle of water. When I buy this bottle of water, I decide I want this bottle of water, not the one with bubbles, and I get this bottle of water, not the one. I mean, what do you do when you vote? You're picking out these two big packages or three packages. In America, it's two packages of everything, and your vote doesn't even affect what happens, and you damn well know that. Whereas it's totally different in a marketplace. Yeah.
Professor Klein, on this point, would there be a difference between, you spoke about public organizations in general, would there be a difference between government agencies and political parties in that sense? Because parties have to compete for the voters' vote, whereas government agencies are already in power. So would their behavior be different in that sense?
Yeah, I think they are different, and that political parties, generally speaking, are more just like a privately run organization or network or association. And so more of these correction mechanisms, I think, would pertain for political parties. They would be more adaptive, more responsive. Now, what they're trying to do is, win government, win the popular opinion of politics. So what it is that's success for them is, kind of an odd thing, a very special kind of thing. It's not like people who are selling bottled water and just want to sort of make more money, let's say. So, yeah, but I do think that's right. Political parties are quite different than the government proper. And political parties in and of themselves don't have the power of coercion. I mean, that's how we define government, is that it's got this it's a special player with a special power of coercion. That's what makes it, and it's not a criminal organization, because criminals, generally speaking, they don't tell you, they don't put up a website, like a guy who steals your car or breaks into your house. He'll say, here's my website. I'm going to come to your house at 3 a.m. Here's what I'm going to take. If you try to stop me, this is what we're going to do to you. Right? They're totally open about the coercion. The government is. It's a very special, institutionalized, legitimized system of coercion. And so a government is a very special player.
If I can just sort of intervene on this point. The analogy between market and, the market and elections is of course set forth by Schumpeter. He's the great theorist of this kind of analogy.
And Buchanan as well.
Yeah, but Schumpeter is the first, it's a much older view. He describes democracy simply as a kind of competition for selling you some kind of candidate who will hold power. So it's it's a sort of quite the first traditional break with conventional democracy as being a set of values. But I don't think it works very well, the Schumpeter analysis. One could discuss about it, but it's actually in that text called Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy, which was published when? In
42.
It doesn't work because we don't have the same element of control that we have when we buy any kind of goods. You get your water, if you don't like it, you buy something else. If you elect someone, it's much more complicated, both in motives and...
And your choice doesn't even affect the
I just
outcome.
wanted to remind us that there is actually this very classic kind of doctrine about
Well, and in a sense, it's also interesting to think about the way in which the analogy was now updated by thinking that what you do have in government is that in democratic government, in this oligarchic competition, is basically a tendency to be responsive and accountable because parties are trying to think ahead of people's reaction. And I don't know, I think that's a lot of that seemed quite reasonable in the 60s, where, because in the 60s everybody was really thinking that, the median voter was the one determining the outcome of the election. And we do have quite an experience lately in which the way in which elections work are not exactly by shifting the mind of the median voter, but it's actually the other way around. It's by polarization, by activating groups in societies and mobilizing them just to show up and vote, which is a totally different frame. One way is assuming that everybody's now even about showing up on election day. The other frame is, well, lots of people just prefer staying home. What really matters is activating parts of society. Of course, you do have huge discussion on the electoral system and the way in which conditions are formed and all of that. So it's a very interesting analogy also for the way it comes up, but certainly it has limits. I think you were also pointing out something different, which is, what these people are competing for. So in a way, your point was on these different parties, what are they competing for? They're competing for, having somehow a privileged way to the use of force in a certain period of time. So in a sense, they're not placing products, but they want to be in control of the means of producing a particular kind of service. And I think that's a very sensible, that's a very important point. One thing I wonder about is how do you match that anyway with the description you've given before? Because somehow you said, we have people in agencies. Of course, they believe they're important. All of us do believe we are important, right? We all hope we're doing something important and nice. And this put them in a situation in which it's very difficult for them to value alternatives in an open way. But when it comes to purely, I mean, if you consider a pure politician, the best political entrepreneur ever should be totally indifferent about content. He should just be selling the stuff that brings him to office. That's the thing. He should have no conviction. Of course, he should believe the government he wants to lead is important and useful in society. But in a way, he should be very not bound at all by
Not if being in office is his only concern. But I don't think that is people's only concern. I think people are ideological. Right. Other questions?
comments.
What if the effectiveness of a policy towards a certain objective is debated? Or better, what if the means to achieve a certain objective are debated, so that maybe the objective is common to the parties debating, or there is widespread belief that one objective is right, but there is debate about the means to achieve it. So there will be different opinions about the effectiveness of each means to reach a given target. So in that way, it's not unequivocal to establish what a bad policy is, or
In that way, it's not.
it's not perfectly established whereas a policy is good or not. So all the debate that we're having is based on the assumption that we can establish what is a bad policy and what is a good policy. What about cases where it is still debated?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there are cases where I'm not sure, I can't presuppose that certain policies are bad and certain policies are good, and then ask, okay, so why are these bad policies in play? That's true for some, but I'm very comfortable for a whole lot of policies actually just kind of presupposing, look, I know that rent control, I know that government-owned housing, I know that a lot of land use regulation, I know, just like I said, government subsidization of sports stadiums, minimum wage laws, I realize that not everybody is going to, accept my presuppositions here about the policy being bad. But we still want to, we want to have this conversation about why would something that is a bad policy perhaps come to be and persist. And I think no matter which two people we are, like whoever we are out there, pick that person in the street, and we pull them in here and we have a conversation, we'll probably find some things that we agree on as bad policy. And so we can ask, okay, so why, if we think this is bad policy, if we now suppose it's bad policy, why is it there? And so then this kind of theorizing becomes relevant, I think. So, I agree with you that we're not always comfortable asserting there's a good and a bad policy. Sometimes, like, I don't know what to do about global warming. I don't know what to do about certain things, I don't know what good policy is. But there's plenty, I do feel like I'm ready to say this is bad policy. We need a theory about why it's here.
My question was more about, would the behavioral model of government agencies change in the case that it is sure whether a policy is effective or not, and the case when it is debated whether a policy is effective or not? Does the behavior change, the behavioral mechanism that lead a person to believe in the effectiveness of a policy or not change?
You'd like to think so, but I think it's harder to make it as simple as that, because there's so many different aspects of outcomes, actually. And they'll say, okay, well, there's this, but it's I don't know, it's safer, but it's more expensive, and good and bad, and so it's not so easy to just say there's this one dimension, we measure it, this is the outcome, it's successful or it's a failure. Then people are going to start interpreting the outcomes differently. What matters to the outcome, the dimensions of goodness, and so you're going to get into debate. It seems like no matter what, there's going to be people disagreeing about how good the policy is.
But I think she's trying to get at how can we get out of the status quo, so to speak, and how is change
Okay.
possible? And I think there are empirical examples of change being possible, where governments have, you know, reformed pension plans that are obviously bad policy, where, you know, they do stuff that, you know, sort of change. And you perhaps hinted at that with the Trump card, where you say that new people come in and they implement change, and they actually radically change government policy.
Is that right? Are you getting at like,
How to get out of.
No, actually, we start from the assumption that we have policies that are generally believed to be bad,
yes.
and we're policies that are widely debated. For example, what to do about climate change.
Yeah.
And my question was, does the behavioral model of people in power change in the two instances? Like, when a policy is bad, you have to either convince yourself that the policy is not so bad, or to find a motivation why you don't want to change it. Whereas if you're not sure whether a policy is bad or good, you have the option to say, I'm not sure. So I don't know what to do about it. I don't know what the best option is. So there must be some difference in the two instances.
Yeah, in the first case, we're, you know, some of us are having a conversation about this policy is bad, right? I'm not saying that everybody who matters agrees with that. I mean, there's gonna be people who still say it's good. I mean, all those policies that I had on my first slide, or almost my first slide, will have their defenders. I mean, they'll even be, you do a public poll, do a Gallup poll.
I think you're using bad basically as policies that are obviously discredited in terms of the economic reasoning underpinning. That's your.
Yeah, discredited among economists.
Yes.
Like these ones, I would
That's
say, most
bad.
economists, like we're not allowed to pay for kidneys. Like, I'm not allowed to buy your kidney, okay? You're not allowed to sell me your kidney. That's bad policy. I mean, I feel that's bad policy. I'm very prepared to say that's bad policy. I mean, basically, your second
Surely
kidney,
that's arguable.
sorry?
Surely some of these points are arguable.
Well,
Controversial.
that's right. I mean, that's kind of what I'm saying. Like, people are gonna say they're arguable, but I'm gonna say, I've heard the arguments, and it's bad policy. Yeah. I mean, who thinks that you should be free and to sell your kidney? Raise your hand. Okay, so most of you are wrong. Like, most of you don't know what good policy is here. And I realize that this kind of presupposition is going to be involved when we talk about certain policies.
But I think that doesn't really matter. I mean, it doesn't really matter what you think is.
That's right.
Then
I think-
everything is debatable.
I'm sorry?
Then everything is debatable. There is no
Yes, it is.
there is no empirical certainty about what policies are good or right, because there will always be people arguing that one policy is bad anyways.
Well, then you're saying that nothing is ever empirically certain, so we can never say if the policy is good or
No,
bad.
For
In
example,
favor,
you
may I intervene in favor of which is the.
Are you for kidney sales?
No, no. I think that while I disagree, as before I said, with the asymmetry, and I even more disagree that you can't say that what are bad and good policy out of chairs, you know, just because economists say that is right, that all the rest is bad policy. But in one argument in favor of the asymmetry, is that performance is ambiguous in the public sector. So it's exactly what she was saying. So when you don't know actually whether a policy is good or bad, and your argument about the market, in that sense, is sort of valid, I think, in the sense that you have more feedback, you test more whether you're right or wrong. While in public field, you have less tests, so performance is more ambiguous, and therefore biases may be stronger. But so it's just a procedural argument. I don't think that you can decide what is bad and good policies and then say that government officials are more biased than in the private because you decided what is bad and good. I think that is not possible.
If I can make a methodological suggestion, a more sort of manageable way of thinking about this, it's not really whether some policy is good or bad, just, in the abstract or according to anyone's judgment, but simply whether it satisfies a requirement. I mean, suppose the government has committed itself to provide more housing accessible to the large amount of the population. And then you can say that rent control is a good or bad means to achieve that target. So at least if you know what you're trying to do, you decide beforehand, then it is easier to measure whether the policy is effective or not, rather than, just judging in the abstract.
But in many ways, that's the meaning, I think, of the least. I mean, bad policies are those policies whose result basically contradict the aim. The problem is, of course, that even the conversation about outcomes of policies is pretty limited. I mean, if you think about the biggest, if you think about the public conversation, it's all about the aims. So you've got good intentions, that's enough. It's not about what the processes produce, and your aims may be wonderful. You may think that we want to have cheap housing for everybody.
It's difficult.
But then you've got rent control, and that's what you call is exactly the opposite.
I think it's true
That's
that
right.
there's not
It's
enough
more difficult.
real attention to the outcomes and results, and there's too much just going on the stated intentions. But in terms of like how any one of these are assessed, I think it always does really quickly become multidimensional. I think it's really hard to just say it's one thing, like kidneys. I mean, nobody is going to say that people with kidney disease are going to be worse off with liberalizing this in the way I want to, and most all economists want to. But what they'll say is, but it's repugnant to sell body parts. Like people with kidney disease, they'll say, yeah, they're better off, but it's repugnant. It's against, so it quickly goes to some other thing. And I think that's true, generally speaking, with government action, because government is almost like a sacred experience.
I think there are two different layers that should be dealt with separately. One is what economists think is good and what people think is good. Okay, that's one thing which has to do with the electoral process. One different
That's
thing
what
is
economists
what the
believe.
economists think is good or bad, and what government officials think is good or bad. I mean, in the public, what Alberto said is very correct if you are talking about the public debate on whatever. I mean, you open daily magazines and you find a lot of talk on aims and not on means. But when you get into a ministry or a public agency, then the talk is about means.
And results, you mean?
Aims and means.
When you say means, do you mean you're
the
saying results?
instruments, policies.
And the results of the policies?
Yeah, well, I mean,
Outcomes.
when I say means,
Outcomes.
what I do to get where I want. And then,
But what about talking about whether you ever get to where you?
that's another issue again, that's evaluation.
Okay.
And I believe in Italy, for example, we do not have a culture of evaluation. We do not evaluate anything. When I was at the Ministry of Economic Development, I was very much against some subsidies we were giving away. And the answer I got from the people within the ministry was, well, no, this is a very good subsidy, very effective. And I said, why? Show me, did you make any evaluation? They said, yes, we did. And we made like 1 billion available, and we had requests for 2 billion. So that was a demonstration that the subsidy was effective. which is okay. If I throw money out of the window and then I look on the ground and I find nothing left, does that mean that the policy is effective? No. Anyway, the interesting issue in your speech is why government officials, the opinions of government officials are much closer to the opinion of the average person than to the opinion of the experts. I mean,
Which experts?
economic experts.
Well, why
They,
do you agree
for
with
example,
with
rent control.
economists?
I mean,
That's the
no,
point.
most people outside here would say that rent control is good because it's an instrument to make way for fairness or whatever. And I would say not a single economist would say that rent control is good.
I wouldn't go that far.
Oh, okay,
I wish.
a few of them, but the large majority.
Probably 20% in Italy, and maybe 10% in the US. I don't know.
Okay, let's say a small minority of economists would say rent
30% in Italy. I don't know.
rent control is good. If you ask the same question within the Ministry of Administrative Affairs, I would say that you would get 80% of people in favor of rent control.
Especially if it's the policy.
Exactly. So the question is, why do government officials have opinions which are closer to the opinions of the lay people than to the opinions of the experts, whereas you would expect experts to be within public agencies?
Right. Again, you gotta be careful with the word experts here, because like the Hayek quote and what I've been saying is that the experts are not like the liberal economists.
Yeah, I agree.
So we don't use, so you're really meaning like the liberal
No,
economists.
I mean like economists.
Well, yeah, economists are more, sorry?
People who study the outcomes.
Well, no, I think this is an ideological issue here. And basically we're saying economists are more liberal than most people. They're the most liberal of the social science and humanities professors, classically liberal. And so they're a relatively quite liberal group and so and I'm one of them, and that's, my view, that's being reflected in my statements about what's good and what's bad policy. Why, so in a sense, your question is, why are economists more liberal than the average person?
Yeah, well,
I mean, that's sort of what you're saying.
my answer would be that
And-
because evidence is more liberal than the average person.
Yeah, and then your question is like, why are the government officials not more liberal than the average person? Why should they be? Why should they be?
Well,
How do you get to be more liberal?
if you take a Weberian point of view, you would expect government officials to pay at least as much attention as economists to what the evidence tells about, for example, the effectiveness of a policy.
Yeah.
But the core of your speech was that, as I understood it, that government officials have relatively little interest in what the evidence says, because they are in favor of expanding the organization they work in for a
But
variety of reasons.
partly my explanation is they're interested in the outcomes and they're paying attention, but they're operating under a bad system of beliefs, so they're misinterpreting the results.
And I think this is a very interesting nuance in your speech, in your talk. I mean, your talk is not basically saying, they are acting in their own interest. So they are expanding their own structure because they are just self-interested actors, which would be more or less the usual public choice talk. These guys want to be more powerful, so who doesn't? Your point is, in a way, that biases are stronger than self-interest. And I think that's very interesting point, and I'd like to ask you, are you sure? But is it perhaps self-interest?
I'm not really separating. I'm kind of putting them together and suggesting that the self-interest forces are affecting which biases and beliefs survive and come forward. And so it's kind of like a layered story. And at one layer, they're more or less honest and sincere, but misinterpreting. Now you could say, well, are they honest about digging deeper into their own beliefs? And then maybe at that layer you'd say, no, they've been irresponsible. Like they haven't challenged themselves enough. But how deep do you want to go with people? I mean, we all have to stop somewhere. Youth.
We're living in a system that it's like a democracy, a representative democracy. So we are asking ourselves why policymakers are not as liberal as the average Italian or American. We live in a representative democracy. Policymakers do or does what the most people think is better to do. And they are looking for votes, also for electoral purposes. They are not looking for things that are getting better. I mean, that should coincide in my mind, our mind, but for our leaders, they take much more the point of getting more votes instead of getting things better. So if we live in a democracy, in a representative democracy.
Yeah. A lot of these officials in these agencies are not there by election and do not stand for election. So they're just career officials. So they're appointees, and they don't really, if they have concern about social well-being, you'd think that would drive some of their thinking about their policy making. I mean, they do play a part.
Yeah, and another thing is what we can see in our politicians. They're doing things for the electorate, and the electorate can be the whole Italy, but it can be also regional. For example, one main purpose here in Italy is in the TAV, the high speed railway, may affect the whole north, and so the north can think the average can agree mostly with the realization of this building, but other people, like for our second force of government, the first one, and the movement of 5 stars, they're looking for votes that come from other regions. They're looking for other things, and this can be checked for Trump administration or for the state administration, but can be also regional, the votes and the proposes, not national.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I understand that. Local interests is, I think I follow you.
Yeah, so the liberal view can exist, of course. I'm a supporter,
but they use the system to get their special interest benefits in a non-liberal way. Is that your point?
No, I mean,
that's not your point.
No, yeah, that's my point.
Okay.
I mean, I do not agree. I actually do not agree, but that's the real point. The facts.
Mm-hmm.
I think a very relevant question when it comes to your what to do, hope or not, is you got people that believe that at the end of the day, individual liberty is safer when people's options and behaviors are in the hand of unelected officials. So sort of well-run administrative state. And you got people instead that believe that people's freedom is in better hands, in the hands of elected officials. Now that's a very interesting question, more generally speaking. But it's very. I think the answer varies a lot, country by country. I mean, a German administrative state is by definition very different than an Italian administrative state. And of course, one thing which you're not mentioning here is how these agencies are checked by courts, which I suppose is it makes a huge difference.
That's obviously very important problem. I mean, if you give power to the non-elected, as sometimes it is necessary to do, suppose you need advice for what you have to decide what to do with your atomic, nuclear centrals and so on. You can't. You have to address yourself to people who know what they're talking about. But then or to introduce new medical treatments or whatever. The problem is who checks the technicians, how they're selected, and so it becomes a very complicated. I mean, in contemporary government, I think there is a big shift. I mean, more and more power is in fact in the hands of the non-elected. Mercifully so, probably, because there are very complicated issues that wouldn't be adequately addressed by the elected. But the question is that there is then a problem of who supervise, controls, checks. Technicians are much more difficult to. What do you do if all your medical specialists sitting on a committee, in fact, emanate from lobbyists, from the people who actually produce and sell these products and so on. So it's a very tricky. Can I ask you a question about the United States? I mean, what is the background of American state officials? I mean, do they come from the same type of schools or formation, universities? Is there a pattern as there is in France, for example?
No, I don't think it's like the Oxbridge thing in Britain.
No, I was thinking more about, France, Grandes Écoles and that sort of model.
Yeah, I don't think there's any real particular source. There is a disproportionate number of lawyers, but like in Congress, but it's not the story. I think it's quite diverse.
So it's quite open and diverse.
And so education in the US is so expensive that if you end up working for a government agency, you repay your student debts in a few decades instead of in a few years. You go to Yale, then you want to work working for a big law firm or for a bank.
I think most of them go to, like, if we're talking about people in Congress, most of them, go to good colleges and all that. But in the US, it's so many, it's not like this little community of, the few schools in Britain, the way it is. Such a vast area too. I don't know. That's a good question. I haven't really researched it.
I think that
Also, sorry. How do you think does adverse selection plays into all of that? Because if the most skilled people have the possibility to reach top position in corporate jobs where they earn much more than in public state agencies, why would they want to work for the state in any case? Or they might have such a strong motivation towards societal good because they have some very strong belief, but otherwise they would not have some rational reasons to work for public agencies if they just can earn more in the private sector.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you're suggesting that in the United States, those opportunities in the private sector are greater?
Yes.
Yeah, that's plausible too, I think. I would perhaps take issue with you that if somebody wants to work for the public good, they might be more inclined to avoid the public sector. There's a lot of good you can do in the private sector, a lot of good that people do in business in the private sector. So
it may also be a very long-term investment with revolving doors. So
yeah, that's true too.
An agency, and then at a certain point you get out in the private sector and you eventually make some money, but you need to at a very long time horizon. Don't do that proposal. You're saying?
Yeah, no, my point was just that your point was very good, that you have to strike a right balance between what elected officials decide as opposed to what technocrats decide, as opposed to what people decide. And the example I always make, which is which non-Italians would usually not believe, is a referendum we had in 2011 when I think 25 million people voted on the way the cost of capital is assessed in the regulating the price of water. And of course, you had people
Everybody's cup of tea.
voting on something nobody could, or almost nobody could actually understand, and they voted on, in their mind, they were voting on a different question than what was written down on.
That's often the case. That's why referendum is such a bad instrument. In
Definitely.
many cases to make certain types of decisions.
As society and the economy become more complex, of course, you have to rely more and more on unelected officials. Those regulation becomes
Yeah, but
more complex as well.
There's been some focus on the trade-off or the option of should the government influence be that of elected officials on the institution, or should it be unelected experts, administrators and stuff? But the more important issue is like not going down the government tree and
Yeah.
having it not being governmentalized, and hence leaving it to private action, private sector. That's what the arguments, that's what my argument's really about. It's like, this doesn't work well either way. This at least has correction mechanisms at work. And, you know, I think we're way over governmentalized. I think the government should withdraw from so much of what it's in. It's not so much about should it be politicians or should it be bureaucrats.
I think this is, at least in this room, a very uncontroversial point. So a very good one to end with. Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.
École nationale d'administration, c'est juste they come from the south. You all come from the south.
Well, overwhelmingly so, yes, but that's precisely because of that.
Yes.
You do have such a tremendous stream of money which is coming from the north to the south. What that's making is employment more attractive in the south, which is a tragedy for the south in itself. Because of course, you know, it's far more attractive for them to be member of public administration. And if everybody is quite smart, you know, they think, well, why not a government job instead of trying to.
That's good.